Hello everyone, I'm Eve Zimmerman. I'm director of the Newhouse Center for the Humanities. The Newhouse Center is, we're a research center. We support faculty research, student learning, and a diverse array of programming. As many of you may know, when you read the newspaper these days, we hear troubling news about the humanities. It's up against a challenge. Parents are policing what their children are majoring in order that they get jobs. But let me tell you, I don't think that this is the case at Wellesley. I think the humanities is very strong, and one of the reasons for our strengths has to do with collaboration. And this event today is in that collaborative spirit. It is a partnership between the Newhouse Center and the Davis Museum. And I would just like to introduce to you the pioneer, Amanda Gilvin, Senior Curator at the Davis. Amanda was also the convener and leader of a faculty seminar that took place here last spring on Fatimah's wonderful work. And Amanda, I want to thank her for walking across that vast expanse of quad and reaching out to us. And that is how this event came into being. So with great pleasure, it is my honor also to introduce Amanda Gilbert. Thank you.
So much, Eve. Since I arrived here 3 years ago, the programming at the Newhouse has been among many of my favorites, in addition to the Davis programming, of course. I've gotten to see a lot of thinkers that I admire a lot, that I haven't at other universities where I've spent time, and I really appreciate the high caliber of programming that you do, and I feel honored to collaborate on this event with the Newhouse Center. So thanks so much for also being able to see across the quad. So it's my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome you and to introduce our panelists. Today, in addition to our featured artists at the Davis right now, we have invited 3 other artists to dialogue about the very specific and unique medium of indigo, and how it came to play a role of prominence in their artwork. Indigo can be found in a number of different plants, actually, only some of which are good for making dye. Part of what's interesting about it is the molecule itself is blue, which is quite unusual for dye stuffs. And I know we'll hear more about it as a concept, as a material, as a medium, and as a historical phenomenon this afternoon. Our first panelist will be Ken Botnick, who is the Mary Cornell visiting professor here at the Newhouse Center this year. And this means that he'll be teaching a faculty seminar called Mining Special Collections, and looking for a variety of ways to engage with the faculty, staff, and students here at Wellesley. He is a printer and publisher of limited editions. He's a publication designer and professor of art at Washington University in St. Louis. He publishes books under the imprint M-. And you can find a lot of information on his work on his website. He has made books that address many different subjects. But India has been a strong influence and theme for some years now. He first went to India in 2003 to teach a class on typography. Since then, he has conducted research in India on Fulbrights and other eminent fellowships. And he also has directed the Village India program for Washington University. His work is found in collections around the world, including the Library of Congress, the Getty Center for Humanities, the Bodleian Library, the Newberry Library, and the Yale Arts of the Book collection. And I will introduce all of our panelists, and then they'll take turns. So we'll welcome them all in just a moment. After Ken is 2019 Guggenheim winner, Fatimah Tuggar, and you can see her solo exhibition, and I know some of you have already spent time there. Fatimah Tuggar Holmes Horizons at the Davis from now until December 15th. And Fatimah was born in Nigeria and raised there in the United Kingdom, and she studied, lived, and worked in the US since the late 1980s. Her work uses technology as both medium and subject to serve as metaphor for power dynamics. She combines objects, images, and sounds from diverse cultures, geographies, and histories to comment on how media and technology diversely impact local and global realities. Her work seeks to enable the agency of the viewer and participant as implicated in the dynamics of making, subject, object, and experience. To which end she fosters interactivity, even when using so-called traditional and non-technological materials. Her position is that all human making is technological and collaborative. Her work has been exhibited in over 25 countries on 5 continents at venues like the Museum of Modern Art, the Centre Georges Pompidou, and the Second Johannesburg Biennial. In addition to the Guggenheim, she's been the recipient of many awards and commissions, including fellowships from the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University and the Civitella Ranieri Foundation. Next today, we're welcoming Elin Noble, who was born in Munich, Germany, and grew up in the US, Asia, and Europe, and now resides in New Bedford, Massachusetts, not too far. Although she continues to travel very widely. She studied art history in Florence, Italy, and she's traveled and studied in Japan, India, Turkey, Peru, South Africa, Europe, and Mexico. She's the author of Dyes and Paints, a hands-on guide to coloring fabric, the winner of the 1999 Independent Publisher Book Award for the best how-to book. She has a BFA in fiber from the University of Washington. And as former lab manager at Pro Chemical and Dye, she has vast experience and understanding of dyeing. She's appeared on PBS, lectured and conducted dye and paint workshops across North America as well as internationally, and she'll be offering a workshop here tomorrow afternoon, which is already full, so those of you who signed up in time, I know you'll have a great time. But if you didn't sign up for that in time, the Paulson Center, the Paulson Initiative for Study of Place who is a sponsor of this event, actually, that I failed to thank already, will be leading a workshop a more general workshop on natural plant dyeing tomorrow morning, and that starts at 10 a.m. at Paramecium Pond. And I'll get back to Ellen's bio. Her work has been reviewed in Fiber Arts, and it's on the cover of Fine Woodworking Design Book 6, and is included in the traveling exhibition Fiber Art International 2004. She was nominated for Teacher of the Year in 2005 by Professional Quilter magazine. And finally, I'm so pleased to welcome Stephen Hamilton, who I met at a workshop at the Radcliffe Institute on Indigo last year or the year before. It was last year. And we're so pleased to have you here at Wellesley today. He's an artist and arts educator living and working in Boston, and is a visiting lecturer in illustration at Mass Art right now. His work incorporates both Western and African techniques, blending figurative painting and drawing with resist dyeing, weaving, and wood carving. Each image is a marriage between the aesthetic perspectives and artistry of both traditions. As a Black American trained in traditional West African art forms, he treats the acts of weaving, dyeing, and wood carving as ritualized acts of reclamation. He uses traditional techniques and materials native to West Africa to reclaim ancestral knowledge disassociated from Africans in the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. The work explores and heavily references the Black body in pre-colonial African art history, creating visual connections between the past and present. And in this way, he explores elements of Black identity through time and space on its own terms. So we're so looking forward to hearing from each of you and want to give you a warm welcome.
Krishna's messenger approaches and whispers to Radha, "Come, Radha, come. Krishna follows your every desire." The messenger presents Krishna's message to Radha. "Soil my bed with indigo footprints, Kamini. Lay waste to the grove. Savage it with your petal-soft feet. I take your feet in lotus hands, Kamini. You have come far. Lay these gold-flaring anklets across my bed. Let yes flow from your mouth like Amrita. From your breasts, Kamini, I draw off the Dukla cloth. We are no longer separate." The poem is from Kamini's selections from the Gita Govinda of Jayadeva, a book I designed and printed several years ago in collaboration with the Sanskritist Andrew Schelling, who teaches at the Naropa Institute. Written in the 12th century by the poet Jayadeva, the Gita Govinda sings, and it is meant to be sung, of the various states of the love affair between Lord Krishna and his chief consort, Radha. Plagued by his own faithlessness, Krishna longs for oneness with the person who has truly won his heart. Pretty pale part of the story. Radha too longs for that oneness, but lets this Lord Krishna know that she has set some limits of what a woman can take, even from a god. The Gita Govinda, Gita meaning song, and Govinda, another name for Krishna, maps the path of the heart in the throes of love. This Gita is charged with the erotic spiritualism of Indian mythology that so shocks a Judeo-Christian Muslim sense of religious propriety. The Gita Govinda is part of the canon of the Sanskrit literary tradition called bhakti, or devotional poetry. I first learned of bhakti in 1979 from the poet Robert Bly, who gave our press his versions of the Rajasthani mystic Mirabai for publication. The heated, erotic longing of Mira's voice filled our print shop, and Mira has been the patron saint of my shop ever since. Don't go, don't go. I touch your souls. I'm sold to you. No one knows where to find the bhakti path. Show me where to go. I would like my own body to turn into a heap of incense and sandalwood, and you to set a torch to it. When I have fallen down to gray ashes, smear me on your shoulders and chest. Mira says, you who lift the mountains, I have some light. I want to mingle it with yours. Before I went to India, I imagined it only as a world of hot colors, mustard, saffron, turmeric, cayenne, and that is certainly true. Those colors overwhelm the senses. But during my third trip there, my 9 months supported by Fulbright, I began to slip into the interiority expressed by Mira and Jayadeva as I longed to understand this culture that was so elusive to my Western mind. As Duke Ellington might have said, I slipped into mood indigo, and this was helped by the fact that Krishna is always pictured in blues, ranging from the deepest blue-black to palest turquoise. Kamini, which means beloved, or dear one, had to be an expression of blues in inks and papers. The front and back end sheets on the right hand of the images that you're seeing top and bottom were made as paintings with simple printing ink and rollers and multiple layers of ink. Here is the god himself, Krishna, cavorting with his thousands of milkmaid girlfriends in the Vrindavan forest. The illustrations in the book were adapted from my photographs of India, several of them from this wall mural in an abandoned palace in Dungarpur, Rajasthan. The lower image is immediately identifiable in India as being of Radha and Krishna, almost floating on the lotus leaf, signaling a kind of spiritual unity of the male and female spirits. It's something of a cliche to report after a trip to India that it changed my life, but in fact, it changed my life. It has influenced my work in critical ways beyond having introduced me to the beauty of indigo. Possibly the most important is how I now think about pattern. The modernist West has demeaned the role of pattern in art and culture by categorizing it as, quote, merely decorative or ornamental. The idea of pattern was associated with the female, and therefore considered weaker by the European modernists who were reading texts like Adolf Loos's Ornament as Crime. In India and other Eastern traditions, pattern is considered a primary language of vision and expression. Before I began working with indigo dyes on paper, I made a series of pattern books using wood blocks borrowed from the textile printers of Ahmedabad, which is where NID is. Historically, one of the great textile centers of India, Ahmedabad is also home of the Gandhi ashram, where this beautiful indigo paper is made of recycled textiles and paper. I was fortunate enough to spend quite a lot of time in Ahmedabad because it is the home of NID, which is where I was in residence for my Fulbright. I'm a typographer, but I see these books as non-alphabetic texts that emphasize figure-ground relationships through repetition, displacement, overlays, and stencil. A fundamental concept of typographic design is that the space in and around and between the letters should be as considered as the letters themselves. And this is one of the recipes of pattern making. And I have long wondered why we don't teach typography as pattern. I realized, possibly for the first time in Concrete Outcome, the central role of pattern making to my design process. I loved the simplicity of these pieces and the infinite possibilities for combining them for different outcomes. Since these experiments, I've wanted to make a book like a textile and wanted to make it in India. Appropriately, one of the origins of the word textile, taksati, is from Sanskrit, meaning to construct or fashion something. I work with the two-page spread of the book as I would a landscape. I sometimes think I see the entire world in the frame of a two-page spread. So these print pieces were an opportunity to extend the range of how I approach the arrangement of space and elements relative to the page components, the edges of the sheets, and the gutter where the two pages join. In 2018, I was invited to an artist residency in Udaipur, Rajasthan, with the assurance that there was a working press in the studio. Upon arrival, I realized that press wouldn't even have wrung laundry, let alone print on paper. I was a little adrift, but the lesson of India is to ask for help and always be prepared to jump in to a new opportunity. You never know. And so I called my friend Aditi Babel, a former student and now book artist in Udaipur. Aditi knows my love of textile workshops and introduced me to Avaran, which is a highly productive textile design and production workshop. Alka Sharma, the owner, invited me to a small corner of the printing area and made resources available as I needed them. I thought my time at Avaran would be spent primarily block printing on paper, but then I fell into indigo. Not as literally as Fatimah said she had fallen in Africa, but the vats drew me into the world of the dye shed and into a new way of working. And I'm really apologizing for the quality of the color on that screen because these are not the blues that I see in my pictures. But these are the bed sheets that Avaran produces with this wonderful mud resist technique that they use with local muds called dabu, and they literally block print it onto the textile before it gets dyed in the indigo. And this is the printing area at Avaran where they lay out the textiles. It's a spectacular workshop. I just love places like this. Hot as hell, very smelly, but wonderful. And when the block printers saw me printing so badly misregistered. They were freaking out. You know, no sir, no, you don't understand the principle here, because the sign of a great block printer is to be able to print without really knowing where the seams are. So Chachanji had to come in and show me how to print an entire sheet, and I had to print several sheets to prove to them that I really knew how to do this, and the concept was not lost on me. That's my friend on the left, Kalyanji, who's the dye master, and Kalyanji speaks no English, but when they pulled the first sheet out, and you can see the image on the right, the lower band of that is that beautiful telltale green from indigo, and as it oxidizes, it goes to blue. And the one word in English I heard from Kalyanji all week was, with a big smile, magic. And he was very happy about that. These are the pages I've returned with, now trimmed to page size and folded after dyeing. For me, it is a significant shift from applying ink to the paper surface to dyeing the sheet and infusing it with color. This is a significant departure in my working method, and I have to admit that I am struggling to figure out the process and where it takes me. I had no idea this would be the outcome, but India has almost inverted my traditional design process. Designers typically have designed the entire book before venturing into production, so as not to waste work that doesn't end up in the final project. I have tried to find a process that works more freely, a more improvisational method that allows for discovery along the way. I think of it as making the book to discover my subject. Again, I apologize for the way these look. They look really pretty horrible. But the sheet on the right is noticeably lighter because the paper sheets that I had were so large they couldn't fit into the vats. So we folded them in half. The interior side that was kind of shielded always came out lighter, and with these air bubbles that you see. And this was a great thing, was just the unpredictability of this whole process that I found very liberating. Of course, Elin looked at this and knew it right away what was happening. And I've been working with these, the combination of block printing and the pages on these various Japanese fibers. I'll be back in Udaipur October 5th for another week-long stay at Avaran. And in fact, since my time there 18 months ago, now suddenly they have artist residencies. So I'll be bringing back information for all of you. When I arrived at Washington University in 1997, I hoped that someday I would meet William Gass, a literary hero of mine. It turned out that Bill's International Writers Center was just down the hall from our book studio, and we eventually worked on 3 different projects together. I'm happy to report that Bill was one of those heroes who gained in stature the longer I knew him. On Being Blue, one of the many masterpieces Gass left us, includes, as does every Gass book, several beautifully quotable lines. But this one rung a bell that continues to resonate for me 40 years after my first reading. Blue is therefore most suitable as the color of interior life. At the end of William Gass's masterpiece from 1975 is an inscription which begins, "This book was written for all those who live in the country of blue." Finally, as a teacher and studio worker, I devote quite a bit of time to thinking about why we make things. I feel more and more that at the heart of it is longing. A longing for oneness with our process, our materials, our tools, and ourselves. Thank you.
So Nick, Elin, and Steven, I salute you guys. It's always nice to be in the company of other creatives. It doesn't get any better than this. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking just because I have a show on campus. My job is the easiest. I'm just going to do a short introduction similar to the one that I did last night about deep blue wells. Everything I have to say about indigo, blue, or dyeing actually exists in the exhibition. What is it? Across the card. Yes, across the card. So that's it. So the process, the dyeing place that I've been engaged with is the tie-dye wells in Gopher Mata and Kano, which has been around since 1498. And I am not a indigo artist per se. I'm just interested in engaging I think we're in a specific moment in history where a certain kind of knowledge that has to do with this process, specifically the process that they use in the northern part of Nigeria, could end up being extinct with the generation of people before me, because there's nobody else interested in it. So in the 1970s in Gopher Mata, I don't know like before in 1400s, I haven't done as much research, but in the 70s there was about 2,000 wells that actually physically existed there. Now there's less than 200, and out of the 200, not all of them are even in use, because people inherit them, and then when they inherit them, they don't use them. They become garbage dumps, and other people who want to use them would ask if they could pay a minimal sum to use them, and they'll be like, no, that's my inheritance, don't touch it. Or there would be situations where they're like, but you're not using it, trying to explain to them that it could be put to use, and they're like, no. So they become places where plastic bags go to die. The other context for Kano in contemporary days is that there's an influx of exactly the same patterns and material, not material, but patterns made out of inkjets that are flooding the market also. So there's a kind of schism, and there's now actually they're getting much more unionized and organized, the remaining people that are doing the tie-dye at the wells there. So this is why I decided that as somebody who is a maker, for me, I think every making brings with it a certain set of knowledge, and that the way humanity has worked is that we build on prior knowledge, and that we can always innovate and improve and continue. But if we lose certain knowledges, sometimes it's really hard. Recovery becomes much harder. So I thought I wanted to do a project with the tie-dye wells, and I am not an art historian, I am not an anthropologist, so my medium and way of capturing the information is through an artwork, not through those other forms that are much more traditional, either writing a book or something like that. So that's how I embarked on the project. So along with the fabrics on the wall, some of what you will see I have is simulations of 3 wells, each one bringing an aspect of the tie-dye wells when you're in the space, from just dipping and the drips that go back and the ripples that creates in the water, to contexts where you see the chemistry of what is going on, and there's multiple changes of the dye state, to also interesting environmental contexts for the wells, where you see reflections of either the sky or trees inside the wells, because in itself I also found that to be engaging and interesting beyond the question of dyeing. So when you get into the gallery space, I'm not very good with left and right, I'm going to try and do that. Whatever this is. So you walk in the door, on this side, this is what you see. This is a pattern that's called Moon and Star. Women generally do all the designs and the coming up with the patterns, men do the dyeing. That's sort of how traditionally the labor is divided. So in the middle is the moon, then surrounded by the stars, then the clouds are the ripples on the side. It's also interesting, this morning while I was doing a tour with some students in the space, it occurred to me that a lot of these fabrics are designed either with the human looking directly up at the sky or down. And I think it's an interesting dynamic and orientation that's different from how a lot of Western imagery is produced, which is we put it on the wall and it's much more of a horizontal experience. But it seems like a lot of the patterns here deal with a kind of coordinates that look down or look up. So this is another fabric which will be on this side, if this is the entrance to the installation. This is called Zaman Ajo, which is a kind of, like weddings last a week, but there's only, in that whole week, there's only one event connected to the groom. The rest are all like around the bride. So that particular event is this sort of thing where the groom sits in the middle, he's surrounded by his friends, and then other people come and go, giving him blessings and gifts. So that's kind of what that particular design is about. Then there's sunshine, and don't try this at home, but basically the idea is that if you stare at the sun and then you look away and you close your eyes, you'll see multiple suns and then sunspots. And so the bigger ones are the suns, and then the others are the spots. One of the things that I shouldn't fail to say is that these are all augmented reality triggers that I've embedded in each of the fabrics. So when you see color and little stitched in circles, those are augmented reality markers, and there's an app that you can download, or the museum has tablets, they've downloaded it on, and then you hold your device up, and then you can see different experiences from, some of them are sort of documentation of the process, with interviews with the people that live and do this kind of work. Some are my own fantastic visualizations of imaginative ideas that I've come up with. Some are the chemistry of the dye itself and what is happening in the process of making the vat ready in the wells. And as Nick explained, I also tried to be a molecule in the well myself, but no, I just fell into one, so that's what he was teasing about. Then there is, this one is called the Seven Hausa States, Hausa Bokwe, and this is sort of the history of the region and the people, the Hausa people, and so I have like a narrative of how they came to be that is animated in short vignettes, like 7 of them. You don't really have to watch them in any particular order, but if you so desire, it starts here and goes like that. This we've already seen. So I have a couple of, this is, because when I say fantasies or my own visualizations, it might be hard to imagine what that is. So I've pulled a couple with the hope that you can get a sense of what that is like. Oh, they don't work. Escape. Let's see. Maybe I just play them from out here if they don't end up not working. So that's the dye being mixed, which to me was fascinating, that it would have like the range of colors, it wouldn't be what I would expect to be involved. And then I will play this. I will play. Thank you.
Good. Okay, so good afternoon. I'm really pleased to be part of this panel. So thank you, Amanda and Fatimah, for making this all happen, and it's fantastic. So on the screen that you have here, it's a photograph from Japan. And on the left, you see dried indigo leaves. And on the right is tsukumo, which is the composted indigo plant. I put this image up because my early career as an indigo dyer has been connected to the dye and textile traditions of Japan. More recently, I have also been connected to the revival of indigo and woad dyeing in France. I first encountered indigo dyeing through the textile artist Barbara Goldberg. Barbara was a professor of textiles at Boston University in the program in artisanry. And in 1986, the artisanry program moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and joined the College of Visual and Performing Art at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. On the screen is a work by Barbara Goldberg. It combines indigo and shibori and is from 1982. I never consciously set out to become a dyer, but as a student at the University of Washington in Seattle, I was introduced to dyeing with both natural and synthetic dyes. It was only later, through my friendship in New Bedford with Barbara Goldberg, that I was introduced to indigo dyeing and its rich history. So Barbara had studied with the Japanese-American artist Yoshiko Wada in the early 1980s. In the U.S., the history of indigo with shibori patterning is ultimately and intimately connected to Yoshiko's teaching and writing. On the screen, it is a recent image of Yoshiko Wada, and on the left is the cover of her first book, Shibori, The Inventive Art of Japanese Shaped Resist Dyeing, from 1983. It was under Barbara Goldberg's mentorship and from my studying of Yoshiko Wada's book that I became an indigo dyer. My primary interest in indigo was the investigation of the sophisticated tie-dye process from Japan known as shibori. Indigo is a dye and a process, but it is how it gets expressed or manifested on the cloth that is truly exciting for a dyer. For many indigo dyers around the world, it is a never-ending fascination, and many contemporary artists are both renewing and keeping the tradition alive. Shibori is a complex Japanese tie-dye process, but versions of tie-dye are found around the world in many different cultures. In the tie-dye process, cloth is stitched, twisted, compressed, and clamped into a three-dimensional shape before dyeing. The compressed-shaped cloth allows the dye to attach to the exposed areas while it's not able to attach itself to the compressed areas. On the screen on the left is cloth that is ready to be dyed. You can see the areas that have been wound with thread in order to resist the dye. On the right, the cloth has been dyed and the tie-dye threads have been removed, showing the resulting pattern. On the screen is a cloth I dyed in 1988. Complex repeat patterning is generally what is pursued in indigo shibori dyeing. For me, from the beginning, there was an interest in creating visual imagery that could stand alone. I was pursuing how to combine many layers of compression or resist techniques in one piece of cloth, layering indigo dyed patterns on top of one another. Doing this, there is always an element of the unexpected, of chance. I continue getting involved in shibori as it is practiced in Japan. In 1988, I took a 4-day indigo class in Seattle, taught by the Japanese artist and indigo dyer Hiroyuki Shindo, and I later studied with him in Japan. On the screen is a photograph of Hiroyuki Shindo and me taken in Kyoto last year, where we met up at a gallery opening. Hiroyuki Shindo taught me what he refers to as the pulse and the breath of the indigo vat. His vats are made with tsukumo, the fermented vat made with the composted indigo plants. It is a dye vat that takes time and patience to maintain. There has to be a loving relationship between the dyer and the vat in order to produce a deep and clear blue color on the cloth. And he lives in an old farmhouse in Miyama, which is about an hour or so west of Kyoto. Here are his large ceramic in-ground dye pots. A heater is placed in the ground between the 4 vats to keep the indigo the proper temperature for dyeing. On the left, he is dyeing a piece of cloth in one of the indigo vats. Clearly, dyeing like this is very physical work, and personally, I really admire his flexibility. And as an artist and as an educator, he has had a long and distinguished career in Japan, as well as internationally. This is an example of his work. For this body of work, he delicately lays the cloth on top of the indigo vat, letting the cloth soak up cloud-like or pond-like forms. His work is very much tied into the Japanese sensibility of manifesting the spiritual energy that's found in nature. There is a magic when dyeing with indigo. The vat is alive and breathing and has to be tended to continuously. The foam on top of the vat is oxidized indigo with the characteristic deep blue. And under the deep blue surface of the vat, the actual dye bath is a yellowish green color, as Fatimah just showed in that little video. So when the cloth comes out of the vat, it is momentarily this greenish yellow, and then quickly, due to oxidation, starts to turn a darker green and then finally blue. In the late 1980s, I ran a production studio in New Bedford called Kire of indigo-dyed scarves, kimono-style jackets, and some fashion and home accessories. At its height, I had 8 25-gallon indigo vats going at the same time in the studio. I dyed mostly silk, but occasionally I dyed linen and cotton. These items were marketed across the U.S. and were also sold in Germany and Japan. The day-to-day maintenance of the vats taught me a tremendous amount about the life cycle of an indigo vat. Indigo is not soluble in water and needs to be reduced for the indigo to be available to the cloth. This means oxygen has to be taken out of the vat environment, similar in principle to oxygen being taken out of a ceramics firing in order to develop the glaze colors. There are many ways to take the oxygen out of the vat, or reduce the vat. And during my indigo production years, I explored many different ways to do this, from fermentation with sugars, reduction by way of metals such as zinc or iron, and the straight chemical reduction used in industry, which is usually sulfur-based. Each type of reduction vat has its own personality, each needing a specific temperature and reduction time. One type of reduction is not necessarily better than another type, but different reduction types fit different seasons or working environments within the studio. During dyeing, the intensity of the color depends on how many times and how long the cloth is submerged in the indigo vat. This image illustrates how the color deepens the more it is dipped into the indigo. In 1982, when I moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, I became friends with the owners of a dye distribution company called Pro Chemical and Dye, which is in Fall River. One of the owners, Don Wiener, was a dye chemist and became another of my mentors. During my frequent visits, this is while I ran Kire, I furthered my lifelong learning of how to, as I express it, think like a dye. And in 1992, I finally went to work for Pro Chemical and Dye. I ran their technical laboratory to safeguard quality control, and I also wrote directions for the many types of dyes we distributed to small businesses, including artists and hobbyists. My experiences at Pro Chemical and Dye led me to writing the book Dyes and Paints, which was published in 1998. It's not about indigo, but it is about one particular type of dye called fiber reactive dyes. It's also about textile paints. In 1992, I also traveled to Japan to attend the first International Shibori Symposium in Nagoya. Near Nagoya is Eramatsu and Narumi, 2 towns that were and still are the heart of shibori and indigo in Japan. Although There are many other individuals all over Japan keeping these traditions alive. They're both young and old. And this photograph of me is actually from 2014. I'm standing next to memorial stones commemorating when shibori dyeing began in Aramatsu in the early 17th century. And in the last 20 years, since the beginning of the 21st century, there has been a renewed interest in natural dyes. In 2002, the French dyer and historian Michel Garcia was part of a group that created a botanical garden in Loris in Provence in southern France, which you see here on the screen. Since then, Michel Garcia has become more and more well known for his historical research into 17th and 18th century dye processes in Europe. The garden grows many dye plants that have historical significance, including woad and indigo. And in 2011, I attended the filming of the DVD called Natural Dye Workshop, Colors of Provence Using Sustainable Methods, produced by Slow Fiber Studios, which was created by Yoshiko Wada. There are, by now, 3 more DVDs in the series. Here, Michel Garcia is shown during the filming recreating the old Provençal dye process. Augmenting the footage in each DVD are written directions which are prepared in collaboration with the dyer Catherine Ellis and myself. And in this photo, Michel is seen stripping leaves off of the woad plant. Woad, which is Itastis tinctora, contains small amounts of indican, which is the blue coloring compound found in indigo plants. Woad was cultivated early in Europe and used for hundreds of years for dyeing and also for paints. The blue shutters you see in southern France has its history based in the woad fields from 600 years ago. After Vasco da Gama discovered a sea route to India, processed indigo dye began to be imported. This indigo contained far more indican than the woad plant, and eventually the indigo seeds of Indigofera tinctora were imported, and by the 1730s, indigo fields quickly replaced the woad fields in England, Germany, and France. In the early 20th century, both woad and indigo were replaced by a synthetic version of indigo, which is chemically identical to natural indigo. And on an aside note, those old indigo and woad fields are also now vineyards. So where am I in my relationship to indigo today? For some years, a group of dyers and I have been meeting regularly to exchange knowledge and experiments. Here I am in North Carolina with some of these friends, including Catherine Ellis, Yoshiko Wada, and the Danish textile chemist Joy Boutrup. What I find truly satisfying is that the exploration of dyes is a never-ending pursuit, and that those engaged in it share freely all the new discoveries and approaches. Applying indigo to cloth is obviously a process I enjoy. And another process that I've been investigating lately is to selectively remove indigo from dyed cloth. The first step in the process turns the cloth brown. And when the brown color is removed, that is, of course, if you want to remove the brown color, you get white in places where the brown was. And in traditional indigo dye process, you end up with white pattern on a blue background. When you remove the indigo, which is called discharge, you end up with a blue pattern on a white or brown background. In other words, it's a reversal. I teach indigo and natural dye classes as well as synthetic dye classes across North America and also internationally. It is exciting to watch people experience indigo dyeing for the first time. Since the students actually become chemists, they see magic happen in front of their eyes. It brings childlike curiosity out of everyone that experiences the process. This photograph is of student work from a dye class I taught on removing indigo in the Netherlands last year. In the spring of 2020, I will be bringing a group of students to an indigo dye class in Japan. I will not be teaching the class. The class will be taught by Brian Whitehead, a Canadian that has lived in Japan since the late 1980s. What is remarkable about Brian Whitehead is that he has managed to revive and be instructed in silk production, covering all steps, from cultivating the worms, growing the mulberry to feed the worms, harvesting the silk, spinning, dyeing, and then finally weaving the cloth. So on the left is an early photograph of Brian with Minako Kato, who during a 6-year apprenticeship taught him every step of the silk production process. He was fortunate to meet one of the last women in the area still practicing this type of self-sufficiency. So on the right is Brian with Minako Kato a few years ago, just before she died at the age of 99. This is a photograph of Brian Whitehead's farmhouse, which is about an hour to the west of Tokyo. For me, Brian represents another aspect of how craft traditions are revived and renewed. He enjoys teaching and making this information available to small groups of students, beginners as well as advanced. All those of us who engage in dyeing seem to form a never-ending chain of practitioners. Indigo truly has universal appeal. Its use dates back many millennium. It has been found in Egyptian mummy wrappings, and earlier this year was found on a 6,000-year-old burial cloth along the central coast of Peru. On the screen is one of these 6,000-year-old Peruvian cloths. I'm quite honored to be part of a tradition that stretches back, truly, to the beginnings of mankind. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Hamilton. Thank you so much for having me here. I am a multimedia artist. I also identify as a traditional artisan. I learned traditional weaving, dyeing, and wood carving at the Nikkei Center for Art and Culture in Osogbo, Ogidi, Jumu, and Lagos. I'm in Nigeria between 2015 and 2016. All of the work that you see here is work that's either hand-woven and or hand-dyed using traditional West African dyes. So indigo, camwood, kola nut, various barks from acacia and terminalia trees. First, I would like to discuss and clarify the statement about me, the act of weaving and dyeing as a Black American as an act of reclamation. When I was in Nigeria between 2015 and 2016, it was a very important experience for me. I was learning traditional weaving and dyeing there. I was learning more about traditional Yoruba religion and culture there. And I was in a place surrounded by cotton and indigo. And it made me think about hypothetical stories of ancestors. I thought about women who, as young girls, spun cotton, dyed indigo as dyers, wove the textiles that would have been used for everyday use, for weddings, ceremonies, cloth that would have been used for ritual purposes. And I think about all of the love and all of the passion and all the important spiritual essence which is put into those textiles. And I think about those same skills being exploited in plantations in the Caribbean and in the Americas. Something which was built around the community being exploited in a way, exploited in that way, and those women never receiving any justice for it. So I think about learning those art forms, going and learning those art forms as an act of reclaiming them. And I often talk about that in my work as an act of reclaiming my mother's hands. So how do we reclaim that, and how do we take ownership of that as people in the diaspora that have been dissociated from it? I wouldn't be here talking to you if not for my teacher, Miss Agnes Umeche. Miss Agnes Umeche was my teacher at the Nikkei Center for Art and Culture in Ogidi. She is from a town called Okene, which is also in Kogi State. She is an Abira weaver. The Abira are legendary weavers. And the town of Okene is a town very much known for its beautiful textiles woven on the upright loom. Here's me weaving on my upright loom back in the United States, an image of a Yoruba woman also setting an upright loom. This loom is indigenous to Nigeria and Togo, and it's used all over Nigeria. Its centers of practice are mostly in the south, but it is used very frequently in the north as well. Indigo is very important to me. It's very important in Nigeria and the history of Nigeria. And amongst the Yoruba people, it has very strong significance, as indigo is associated with the gods. Orisha are dyers. Oshun is a dyer. Yamaja is a dyer. The city of Osogbo was founded when Laroye and Aguntimeng were felling trees in the sacred forest and broke Oshun's indigo pots. These industries are very much tied to important and potent spiritual forces. The women, because amongst the Yoruba, until recently, it was exclusively the profession of women, are regarded as very important figures in Yoruba culture and mythology. If we think about the divine mothers, the Awon Yawa, the Eleye, they are often associated with dyers. There's plenty of verses from Ifa which talk about the powerful dyers, the powerful women. Indigo, because its process is so complex and because it is so temperamental, these women have important status, and these women oftentimes were very wealthy in the pre-colonial era, as the beautiful textiles which they created were widely valued, not only in Yoruba land, but all over West Africa. They were exchanged all over West Africa. These are examples of adire textiles that I made while I was there. So adire is the name for resist dyeing in southern Nigeria amongst the Yoruba people. So adire comes from two Yoruba terms, adi, which means to tie, and ire, which means to color or dye. A dyer is called alaro, and the mother of the dye pits, the woman who is the head dyer of a compound, is called ialaro, which is the mother of the dye. These are more images of work that I did when I was there. This is a dyeing with indigo and kola nut. Kola nut is another tradition. It's very important all throughout West Africa. Kola nut was exchanged from southern Nigeria into northern Nigeria, all over West Africa, an important commodity as a stimulant. It's very rich in caffeine, but it's also very rich in tannin. So the kola nut that has been damaged by worms is pounded into a powder, and then you can get a beautiful brown dye from it. When I was there, I was also studying traditional Yoruba religion and philosophy. So I wanted to find ways to combine my experience as an illustrator, as a painter, into the new skills that I was learning as a weaver and dyer. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to document the people that I met there by creating these images, painting them as Orisha, painting them as prominent figures in Yoruba religion and philosophy. So these are all people who are natives of Ogidi Ijumu. A friend of mine, Yakubu, as Orisha Oke, the god of the mountaintop. So Ogidi Ijumu is surrounded by mountains, so Orisha Oke is a very important deity there. At the center is Chief Nike Okundaye, who's a legendary Nigerian artist, also somebody who I have to thank for giving me the opportunity to learn there, a native of Ogidi, as Yamakpo. Yamakpo is the mother of the dye pit. And the Yalaro of Ogidi Ijumu, who's also the queen of Ogidi Ijumu, is featured at the far right of it. And these are all paintings that are painted on hand-woven, hand-dyed textiles. Coming back to the United States, my practice has been changed. So it's been very important for me to find ways in which I can incorporate traditional textile arts into my own practice as an illustrator, but also having conversations about the relevance of indigo and the relevance of these textiles into African spirituality and also the spirituality of the diaspora. And one of the most important things about indigo, specifically in southern Nigeria, is its relationship with water. Oshun, Yamaja, they're both water deities. They're deities of the river, and they're also associated with indigo. So finding ways in which I'm incorporating those different elements into my work has been very important. So the painting that you see is a large painting called Water Spirits, which commemorates the importance of water spirits as powerful feminine forces in southern Nigeria. One of the most important parts of my practice as an artist is the collaborations that I do within community. So when I got back from Nigeria, I got a grant from the New England Foundation for the Arts to create a project called Stitched into Memory. So working with young people of African descent, I was teaching them traditional weaving and dyeing from southern Nigeria. So we learned resist dyeing, we learned traditional weaving on the upright loom, embroidery, and we created this large installation showing the new skills that they had learned. So you're seeing Miss Falilat, who's on the right, who is one of the women in Ogidi, who was also weaving at the center and helping teach me, and like anxiously grabbing the akbasa, that's the beater sword, from me when I was moving too slow. And then two of my students, Jordan and Lewis, who are weaving on modified versions of that same loom. This is us dyeing indigo. We wanted to dye with the elu. So in Yoruba, indigo is called elu. It's made from Longocarpus cyanescens, which is very, very rich in indigo, and native to West Africa. It's the prized indigo. So Indigo ferretinctoria is also native to West Africa, but the dye that you really want to use, the most precious dye, comes from Longocarpus cyanescens, which is called elu amongst the Yoruba people. Unfortunately, trying to dye with elu in Boston in May, where the weather is temperamental, did not work out for us. So we had to use pre-reduced indigo using a chemical reduction process, but we were able to create some very beautiful textiles. And this is an image of the installation that we did together in Congress Street. After that, I had the opportunity to work on a very large project that was very important to me that I wanted to do since I was in high school. So I got I had the opportunity to be part of a public art accelerator through Now and There, which is a public art accelerator in Boston, to create a temporary installation in a Boston neighborhood of my choice. So I'm from Roxbury, which is a historically black neighborhood in Boston. And I wanted to do something to commemorate the legendary progenitors of West and West Central African ethnic groups that are ancestral to the African diaspora. And I wanted to create it in a space that was important to young people. And I also wanted to include young people in this process. So the idea is the faces of our ancestors using our youth as models. Also commemorating the fact that most enslaved people who survived the transatlantic slave trade were teenagers, they were young people. If we think about the last survivor of the transatlantic slave trade in the Americas, the last survivors were Doshi and Cujo Lewis, Koshola Oluwale. They were 19 and in their early teens when they were taken. So for that project, I painted Boston Public School teenagers as legendary founders of West and West Central African ethnic groups on hand-woven fabrics using only dyes native to West Africa, hand carving the frames. So what you're seeing here is a story of Queen Poku giving her only son to the river in exchange for safe passage from fleeing when the Baule people were fleeing the Ashanti people during the Ashanti Wars, in the early Ashanti Baule Wars, during conflicts with the Ashanti royal family in the 18th century. So we see an example of a Baule textile. This textile is also common amongst the Jula people, but we see that being the reference for the textile which is used for the painting. And then we also see the reference of the mother and child, which is an important ancestral figure amongst the Baule and a lot of other West African ethnic groups. Also this other image, again on hand-woven textiles using handcrafted frames of two very important figures in West African legend, Sunjata Keita, the founder of the Mali Empire, on the left, and Yanenga, queen of one of the princesses of Dagbon and the queen mother of the Masi Empire. And both of them are painted on hand-woven, hand-dyed cloth, and you see them both wearing their hunter's jackets, their batakari, which are very common all throughout West Africa. Both of them were legendary warriors. The models for them are Janae Wyatt, who is a freshman in college now, Deshaun Borden, who currently goes to Boston Arts Academy, and Gianna Watson, who's also my goddaughter, is the model for Princess Yanenga. Traditional textiles are incredibly important to me. Using traditional West African dyes is also something very relevant to me because, as Fatimah stated, a lot of these traditions are dying in West Africa. A lot of the thriving textile industries are no longer using natural dyes, and even the ones that are have to face competition with foreign exports. So it's very important for me to incorporate these traditions in my own artistic practice, but also in many ways to pay homage to the incredible skill of these craftspeople. Living in Nigeria gave me a newfound respect for Nigeria as a center for beautifully made items. So if we think about textiles that were manufactured in Nigeria, they were exported all over West Africa. Europeans were actually purchasing textiles made by women in southern Nigeria in exchange for gold and enslaved people in other parts of the continent. So these skills were incredibly important, and it's very important for me to take what I've learned to continue to pay homage and respect to these ancestral traditions. That's something that is important to me both as an educator and as an artist. Thank you.
To come back to the table all together. I would love to hear from each of you what has surprised you about working either with or on indigo as a material, but also as this incredibly important historical phenomenon, which all of you have mentioned.
I think for me is I've been working with indigo for 35 years, a little over 35 years, and I'm actually surprised I'm still working with indigo. It has staying power. There is as there's magic. It's magical when you use it. You just feel like this little kid, no matter how long you've been playing with it and working with it. It has a pulse. It has a life. It's humbling. It doesn't always do what you want it to do. So it provides lessons that I think are important.
I guess for me it's two things. One is, what's surprising is in my short little life, well, for a lot of people I'm really old, but in my short little life, the time that I've been on this planet, from being during my childhood when every village in every home there was a loom, and my grandmother had the same kind of stand-up loom. Like in the north, people had those looms, and then the feet looms. There's another one that's a foot loom, that's a men's loom, and that those things existed, and now there's just like so few of them. Like that for me is one of the most surprising elements anyway that even led for me to try to engage this process, because every village had looms in homes, and then every village had blacksmithing centers, and that those things don't exist, only like far and few between. So that's surprising. But the more surprising thing from the process of learning the step-by-step, the process, it looks like that they're using kind is very similar to the Japanese process, and I believe it's also the same species of plant that they use in India and Japan and northern part of Nigeria. Is that color thing that I showed you guys? For me, that level of chemistry, I didn't realize that the spectrum of color that you have in the vat is very different than what you end up with, that it produces a blue color. So for me, that was probably the most surprising aspect of the process, other than also they prepare the vats and they use them for an entire year. you know, and then they empty them and then they do it again. Like, I wouldn't have thought that those things were prepared just annually. I thought it was, you know, and you were showing some images where you see it swell, like just the level of changes that it goes through in terms of what it looks like, and bubbles up, has like a custody skin. Like, I just didn't realize how complex it was. You know, I thought it was just like how you use like an actual dye from a art supply store, and you mix it with water and you dip things, but it's nothing like that.
Yeah, I think that for me, as a maker of things and as a designer of things, what I'm interested in now is the level of risk at stake in a particular process, and one of the factors of risk for me is unpredictability. And so, you know, designers have this kind of maniacal thing about, you know, everything has to be exactly right, and then you make it. And I'm undoing a lot of that training right now to be able to get to the to the place of being able to respond constantly on the spot. And it's really a lovely way to work. It's very liberating. It's also just very intuitive, and you know, and humbling to be in this dye shed with these. I think we had 6 of these cylinders that go into the ground, and I'm skipping between them, you know, in my tivas and kind of slipping around in there. And after about 3 days of doing that, I said, I asked how deep they were, and they're 3 meters deep. And you know, I thought, oh my God, you know, one false move and you're done. And you know, I'd come out looking like Krishna.
Some of us know about that.
Yes, but it became kind of a metaphor for how I was working in there. Was, you know, you had to be really light on your feet and ready to respond. And yeah, you know, I think for me also, I mean, you know, I'm a white guy from the West. The irony of being attracted to India for indigo, having such a long kind of brutal colonial tradition of taking the textile richness of that place, was not lost on me. I mean, it was, you know, it's really a thing. And to think back to what that period meant to these people, and then to go there really humbly and respectfully, was also an important thing for me.
I think for me it was really interesting seeing the differences. So like before I went to Nigeria, I would talk about, okay, I want to learn about indigo dyeing. I would talk to people in my family and other people in my community. And in the Black community, the people who do talk about indigo, the way that they think about it is that indigo plantations were where they sent slaves to die. So when you escaped, they brought you to an indigo plantation, and the way that the indigo grew is that you couldn't escape past the brambles. And people would work so hard that a lot of times people would die. And also the smell of indigo, when you're like processing it, is like a very powerful smell. So even though there are certain elements of indigo as you know, this magical substance were preserved, it still had this thing about it as being like associated with like, okay, this is like death. But when you go to Nigeria, like finding out that indigo is medicine. So indigo, the spent indigo is rubbed on your skin to close wounds and measles sores. The indigo flower is mixed in your olele, your beans cake, to shrink fibroids. If you have like stomach aches, you take indigo. And like indigo is like this beautiful like medicinal thing. And then seeing how that's like very different from like those same conversations. I had a conversation with a woman who I have amazing respect for, who's a quilter, who told me that story about like indigo is like where they send people to die. And then seeing how much that contrasted. So that was something that was fascinating for me, and I knew that indigo was important socially. I knew that, like, historically, women dyers and weavers oftentimes would gain, like, a lot of economic independence and strength through indigo dyeing. But seeing how much it was tied to the religious and spiritual spaces that I was in was something that was incredibly fascinating and empowering. You know, like being there and being able to experience it.
Thank you. Well, I could ask more questions, but I suspect we have something in the audience. Yeah, I knew it. Thank you.
I was going to ask if indigo was poisonous, and that sort of answers one question. I had the experience of directing an artist colony on one of the Georgia Sea Islands that was a former indigo plantation. And there was no indigo there that anyone knew of when I was there. The spirituality of what the place had been was very present for me. And eventually, somebody found some indigo plants and started growing them for display. And I was surprised at how innocuous they look. Just these little weedy green plants. And I wondered if you could describe what they really look like, because all I saw were things that people were struggling to grow. And also maybe the power of the indigo trade. At the time the indigo was being grown on these plantations, why? Who was buying it and why were they buying it? That's a piece of the history
You're talking about the U.S.?
Here in the U.S. Because it was enslaved peoples. I mean, Stevens gives us both.
So indigo comes from a lot of different plants. So the species that they were growing in the United States were a species of Indigo fera. Indigo fera is used in West Africa. The indigo that I was using in Nigeria and is very popular in Nigeria comes from a different plant. It comes from a large bush called Longocarpus cyanescens, or elu. It's the name of the bush. The process for reducing indigo, no matter what you're getting the sources from, is the same. You have to reduce it, you have to take oxygen out of it, and then you have to, like, grow it. From my knowledge, what it was that the United States and the Caribbean were cultivating indigo so that they could have their own native source of indigo in which they could use as a dye. Indigo is like the king of dyes. It's a very permanent blue dye. And that way they wouldn't have to purchase indigo through trade with India. And with the United States, it was the same thing. Like, you had the Spaniards and you had the French who had their plantations. Them having plantations in the United States would allow them to compete with that trade. And they were using mostly enslaved people who were from indigo producing regions. So Mende women are also legendary indigo dyers. A lot of enslaved people from southern Nigeria were indigo dyers, so they would have had exposure to those plants. And I know that you could explore
And the particular plant that they grew there is part of the bean family. Some of the indigos are part of the brassica family.
Yeah, so that's what they would have grown in the States on the plantations.
And they can get up to about 3 feet tall. They're an annual. They're harvested twice a year. Once they're processed, it's laborious to process it. To get the indican is in the leaf and in the stalk. It's not in the roots. And this is the part that actually is the blue pigment. A lot of that, from that era, from the 1630s and all, that was being grown in the United States, was actually eventually sent to. It was actually they tried to play with it from the 1630s. They could grow it fine, but they couldn't figure out how to process it properly. It wasn't until the middle of the 18th century that they were growing it extensively in the United States, and a lot of it was being sent to England. So a lot of that went to England. Indigo was synthesized in, I think it was 1897. So it was chemically then made, and at that point, indigo production went downhill pretty rapidly all over the world because they could identically reproduce it, what is in the plant form.
What was the date you said?
1897, I think it was.
I'll ask a question of Elin and Stephen. I have some textile friends who have a production outfit in Baroda, India, and they have been using synthetic dyes rather than natural dyes because they felt that there was too much organic material being discharged into the wastewater systems, and that it was causing a lot of growth of organic matter that shouldn't be there. And so with the synthetics, that they felt they were inert and were more reclaimable from their catch basins. So have you stumbled on that along the way?
Not specifically that. I do have some opinions about natural dyes and synthetic dyes. I love both of them. I think there's
Equally?
Yes, they're like children. You like them all the same. I do. They each will give me different types of opportunities. Synthetic dyes are much faster to work with than natural dyes, which are a sequential process that can take a lot of time to do. But also there's the reality of, if we all want to be wearing colored clothes that are not just the colors of the plants that we're harvesting, there's not enough land to grow all the dyes for us to have colorful clothing without having synthetic dyes as part of that mix. It's just we've gotten used to wanting not to just wear, beige. We want colors. I mean, I like this yellow. So that means that we do need some synthetic dyes as well, or there's just not a reality. We also need the land to grow food. I mean, where do you our vineyards in France are because the woad fields aren't there anymore. Mm-hmm. So it's something I fight with a bit, because I like the idea of natural dyes. They also use a tremendous amount of water. Mm-hmm. Most dyeing does, but natural dyes use extensive amounts of water because there's so many sequences to the process. So I don't think it's a good or a bad. I think that as long as people are using things with consciousness, that and in terms of effluent, in terms of using them effectively so that there's not much extra that goes down the drain, then I think that there can be a place for both sides of it. The unfortunate thing in the manufacturing of synthetic dyes is that there is some bad stuff that does usually end up, on the floor, so to speak. But a lot of the dyes that are problematic are no longer made anymore, that are problematic in the manufacturing to the workers or as extremely toxic effluent from the manufacturing. So they've narrowed that down tremendously. But how about for you?
For me, I'm also very conflicted with it because, if we're thinking about feasibility, my experience is a little bit different. One thing that I can say is there is a thriving batik industry in Nigeria, and a lot of that batik industry is expanding on older resist dyeing techniques of adire. So you have adire leko, which is with cassava starch, that was very, very prominent amongst Yoruba women, and now they're using wax for it. And they are using that dyes. The problem is, again, disposal. So in order for it to be, it's one of the things about it, it's one of the most popular things for people to learn. The weaving takes a lot of time, the wood cover takes a lot of time, but the batik, because it is seen as quicker, a lot of people are doing it and learning it. The issue is the disposal of the dye and the disposal of waste. There's caustic lye in it, there's all sorts of other chemical reducers, and they're sort of just poured out anywhere. And that's some of the other issues with other issues in West Africa. Another thing too is also a big conversation a lot of people are having in Nigeria is again, like I said before, Nigeria used to be a place where people made a lot of things, people made things, and people produced a lot of stuff. And thinking about, okay, we were once one of the largest producers of indigo-dyed textiles in the world. They were. They were exporting thousands of yards of indigo-dyed cotton textiles. how do we try to think about revisiting Nigerian indigo production in terms of like people care about natural dyes? How do we reduce and refine our native indigo, and then we can use that for export? Or how are we, thinking about like really replenishing and using like these traditional textile industries and finding ways in which we can compete in a global market with that? That was a conversation that people were having while I was there. So I am still very conflicted about it from the environmental standpoint, and also just being reasonable, but also thinking, okay, if we are going to use synthetic dyes, then how do we think about regulations? How do we think about regulations which also allow, people to be able to be self-starters with that industry? Because I know a lot of people who are able to feed their families and do very well in the batik industry because, they can get these dyes and they can, they're very easy and practical to use. So how do we find that balance? And that is something that I think about a lot as well.
So was the industry in Nigeria, was it blue for blue jeans, for denim that they were
So
dyeing,
what it is
mostly patterns?
it's mostly patterns.
Okay.
So people still will purchase batik, and they'll purchase adire, and they'll take them to the tailor and they'll make their clothes from it. People still use it for ashoebi, for their weddings. And there are prominent Nigerian fashion designers who are using traditional textiles now, not only hand-woven textiles, not only batik textiles, but hand-woven textiles. So there's also been a new industry and people trying to replenish that. I just noticed that, I was around a lot of batik dyers, and I saw, the dyes that people use and how they, dispose of it. So, thinking about how, that in terms of long-term reaction of you continuously using caustic soda and hydrosulfide and things like that.
So I think I'll answer that question even though it wasn't for me. I think in the context of northern Nigeria, given that there is nothing harmful really that goes into it, it's an edible process of using the indigo stalk, the potassium chloride and ash are the only things, like ash by burning any wood. I think that there's limited exposure to some kind of, and then you have it mixed, you have it used for a year, and also it's not a batik process. They're not using batik. It's an actual tying process where women do the tying and men do the dyeing, and then even the ropes and the strings that are used to do the tying are recycled. They take them back to the women do the next design, they bring them. So I think because if they're doing it daily, but once a year is when you have, you empty it. And the good thing about emptying it is that they spread it out, they dry it, and then a lot of people buy it, little round balls that they made out of it as so-called medicine, which I don't know really if it's medicine. I don't have any evidence for it, but a lot of people buy it for stomach aches, for if you have any kind of skin ailment, if you rub it on the skin, especially if you're a teenager with a lot of pimples, it's supposed to take care of it. So there isn't, I would say it's really limited. So the daily use, it would be the water for washing out the fabric, that would be the part of the process, And I guess if just in case there's somebody that doesn't know the difference between, because we didn't explain, you're just throwing the word batik. So batik has to do with laying down the fabric, making a paste out of a root-based plant, which is the cassava, and then using it to spread to cover areas of the fabric. And then when you dye it, after the paste dries, those areas will resist the dye and will not dye the fabric. While as the other process is one where you're either twisting the fabric and tying it, or just tying it, or making stitches to, so where the stitches are, wherever the thread is, it doesn't get dyed. And so those are the kind of the two different processes, And the plant, the other plant, not the Indigo Ferratatura, actually doesn't work for long-term use. It is pounded, and then you can kind of use it pretty much that day or the next day, and that's it. And it's not, it takes, it has a short window of use, and so those are the differences.
There is one thing that has been happening in the United States. In terms of indigo, there's a woman, Sarah Bellows, in Tennessee, Stony Creek Colors, And she's ramping up to, I think, 15,000 acres of indigo that's being grown organically in the United States, in the South. And it's not quite 15,000 yet, but that's her goal in the next couple of years. And what she has done is she's gotten tobacco farmers, because it's a very similar crop to grow. So she's gotten tobacco farmers to move out of tobacco, and they're now growing indigo. And she has chemists and all these people on board to actually go, and they have the machines to harvest from these different places. She's put plants up because to do the processing very quickly, because once you harvest the indigo, the oxidation begins very fast, and you have to be able to get it captured out of the green to be able to get it out of the plant matter, or else it's a composted indigo. And she's wanting indigo that is pure pigment, that can be used either as pigment or can be used for industrial processes of indigo dyeing. And so companies like Patagonia, and I've just lost the other, there's a couple of more that I'm aware of, but that are doing their indigo dyeing all with her dyes. So some of this is starting to change. Again, though, there is, no matter what, you still have, whether you're dyeing, no matter what you're dyeing, it still is a heavy water process. But she does have tanks, stainless steel tanks, where usually it would be in open pits that they would oxidize the indigo to be able to, as you might have seen in India. Did you see them making the indigo from the plant, Ken?
No.
No, okay. They actually, they have to beat it and actually make because when you first soak the indigo, it will be yellow, the indigo plant. And you have to basically beat it or hydrate it in some way to get the oxygen into it. And once it turns blue, it will then be able to form a pigment, fall to the bottom, they can siphon off the water, and they have just the indigo pigment itself, which is what they use, especially in industry, where you don't want the plant material with it. You just want the blue pigment. And she's doing this in all big stainless steel vats, very, very controlled, so that she gets high amounts of indigo, and almost everything is coming out of the plant, more so than what they get just on a home level of processing. So it's quite exciting that some of that is starting to evolve, but still with her 15,000 acres, she's still looking at probably less than 3% of the market of indigo dyeing for jeans and for denim that we're all wearing.
I don't think you can overstate the magnitude of the water problem. I mean, there we are in Rajasthan, which is a desert, and there's this intensive water use going on. And India has a critical shortage of water. I mean, the groundwater is basically depleted and gone in most places. And, this area that has this tradition of all of this incredible craft was never meant for an industrial scale production for export. And, so it's like, what do you do? I mean, they're making these beautiful things, and yet it's export that is, I mean, I think before the Portuguese arrived in India in the 15th century, India was the world's leading exporter of textiles. It was their source of wealth. And then the Brits fixed that. And made them the world's leading importer of textiles by stealing all the raw materials. But this management of resources, my God, it's such a huge, huge problem. And these friends of mine in Baroda are trying desperately to have the lightest footprint on the planet by incorporating a series of catch basins where they're cleaning the water with canna plants and trying to return the water as a clear water that can then be used again through the washing process, which is, I mean, it's just so critical to this process to be able to do things like that.
sure.
Each of you have talked about your distinct experiences based on the cultures you've worked with indigo, whether it be India or Japan or West Africa. I'm wondering what each of you have heard or learned, or what new area of intrigue connects to your own experience that you heard from each other.
I don't think I understand what you're asking. Is it how each of us has learned from each other?
Well, you've
right
all
now?
talked about your own experience, your own cultural experience working with indigo. But we have there's experience here from West Africa and from Japan. I'm wondering if you've heard anything from the other participants that connect with your own experience that's new or intriguing, or is an area of inquiry for you, that you didn't have before this discussion.
Okay, well, I, as a non-indigo artist, will speak, I guess. My interest in it has nothing to do with, I'm not gonna go become a dyer or anything like that. So my interest in it is strictly from thinking of traditional crafts and the knowledge as a knowledge base, because we're all building on prior knowledge, and how one moves forward today with or without indigo, but making sure that the knowledge is preserved from a place where I've noticed that it is in danger of being extinct. So that's my position to begin with. But I mean, I've heard a lot in terms of the different other cultural contexts where people are using it, which is encouraging in the sense that even how similar the Japanese process is to the northern Nigerian process, I think is encouraging, because then there is an opportunity in other parts of the world for the same kind of process to still remain alive.
For me, I'm going to hold on to that image from your master dyer, the clouds on the, that was pretty good. I'm keeping that one. I have to work on that idea.
I think for me, I look mostly to the east for indigo, but my textile collection is quite vast, and I think I have 24 cloths from Africa that are dyed in indigo in my collection. So I'm quite aware of how it's used and the different patternings, in particular in different cultures and all over the world. But I think there's some new aspects that you brought into it, Stephen, that were new to me about indigo being used for a medicine. I think that I had not heard about.
Thank you. I think for me, like, it's amazing hearing from all of you about your experiences working with indigo. I'm very fascinated in learning more about the dykists in northern Nigeria. My experience with indigo dyeing has been from the southern traditions. So I'm really interested in learning more about that, especially its role in the commercial development, and like historically commercially throughout the continent. You know, traders purchasing indigo dyed textiles from Hausa dyers. I know that a lot of our understanding of resist iron and indigo in the United States has come from Japanese workers with Shibori Symposium. Their work was amazing. And I also had no idea about a discharge method with indigo. This is my first time hearing about that, so that's incredibly fascinating.
That's true.
For me, I've never heard of that. And also, again, my experience has been very siloed again to southern Nigeria, so hearing more about your experiences in India have also been incredibly fascinating. And with symposia and conversations that I've seen about indigo dyeing in India, a lot of it is focused again just on the commercial aspects of it, but you touching on its relationship and its references in Hinduism is
Yes.
I want to firstly respond to a point made by Stephen about the medicinal aspect of indigo. As someone who comes from China, indigo is actually part of the Chinese herb medicine. And people say that wearing clothes that are dyed by indigo actually it like treats a wide range of illness, and just makes you healthy in a variety of ways. So I think that's very interesting that you touch upon that. And I have a question for Elin, especially, you have, you have experienced indigo in France and Japan and also the US. I wonder what differences do you see, like in the materials or maybe the techniques or the meaning of indigo in the different cultures?
Most of the United States, the indigo work that is within where I tend to kind of move around deals mostly with artists, and for that, most of them have been looking to Japan. Most of their introduction to indigo has been through Yoshiko Wada, and she started this in the 80s. She and her husband at the time had a shop in Berkeley, California, and from there she really brought this whole process, this whole idea of stitch resist to the United States. It was not really known here very much, except for some loose tie-dye type of things, but she really brought what they were doing in Japan, which is a whole nother level of intention with working with the process of stitching and resisting cloth. I see that Europe has also mostly looked to Japan. They both have history on an industrial level of dyeing for blue jeans and making indigo pigment for paints, especially more so in Europe than in the United States. But I think most of those have really looked more to the east. Europe also did look to Africa, especially France. Actually, France looked a lot to Africa. France was in Africa. But I see the textile traditions that are mostly displayed. I think it's a mix. It's Asian and it's African. In terms of the dyes, they all work the same way. It doesn't matter whether you have if you have a composting vat, you need something in the vat to compost to be able to ferment, which means you can use synthetic indigo, synthesized indigo, manufactured indigo, and put something in that vat that will ferment, and you can get that to reduce. Because again, chemically it's identical. So the indigo could care less if it's chemically been made or if it's been made by a plant. It could care less how you reduce it, as long as it has the environment of the different products are needed to get the oxygen out of there. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Hello. This question is for everyone, and it's about, I guess, preservation and also loss. And I think it's, especially with the style that kind of started with, I guess it's poetic in a way that blue can be linked to this like longing or desire. For example, the landscape at the furthest edge of the horizon is always tinted in blue, and it's the place that we can't reach. And I think with all of the presentations, I see this theme of looking back. And I don't think it's specifically looking back to revive tradition or to like keep tradition in the same way, but then there's this theme of perhaps, especially with Stephen's work, I think it's like inspired by the past, but then reinventing it in a way to fit the present or for the future or an alternative narrative. And I guess I'm wondering, what does the role of preservation or thinking about loss of traditions mean for you in each of your different practices. Whether you're working specifically with indigo, following a traditional method, even in that case, the tradition or what was in the past itself can never be preserved, since like everything from the social to environmental conditions have changed. For example, in the past, before synthetic dyes were made, perhaps if you want to dye, then choosing to use a traditional method with indigo is a relative necessity. But today, it's a choice that you're making. You're saying no to synthetic dyes when you're choosing to work with indigo dyes itself. Or with Fatimah, your exhibition was really intriguing for me because you're also thinking about preservation of something that might be lost, but you're not specifically working with the medium itself. So I imagine there's perspectives on perhaps by abstracting a process and presenting it in this way for preservation, you're already alternating it or presenting it in a different form and leading it away from what it was. So I guess if all of you could speak on maybe the role of loss and preservation and tradition.
I guess for me, as somebody who is working with technology, I am always interested in innovative processes. So, and I'm acutely aware that everything that's come before is what propels us forward in terms of, just the knowledge base that we have. So my interest is not necessarily tied to like some kind of nostalgia of going back to another time, but it's sort of tied to if we can come up with ways to keep the knowledge we have and not lose it, then we have a way forward with that as a base. And so that's specifically my focus. And then I think also like within the context of looking at a region that I knew where everybody had a loom in their house and every city had its own tie-dye wells, to now being like something that's few and far between, I thought it was important to sort of try and intervene and get some information, at least document some information so that, this wouldn't be the last people that know how to do it. Even if we're not going to do it, I think it's good for us to just know the existence of that. And I also think that there's been a lot of, like we've been talking about the transatlantic sort of trade and engagement, and I think it's also good to be aware that there was a trans-Saharan trade route before that where these kinds of fabrics spread and went. So like, for example, even today, the Tuareg people still come to Kano to buy their fabrics that they wear on a daily basis. So I think also thinking about whether internally within the continent, what this means and what the exchange is. And I think that, going a little bit back to this idea of conservation, I think the difficulties with conservation, I think, right now is that we have to closely always tie to environmental justice and be acutely aware that the people using the most resources and the people that can help us, like I recycle, but I'm not sure that it's gonna really save the earth by myself recycling or by all of us in here recycling. And I think that there has to be way more urgency and leadership of doing that, because it's, say in North America, in the West, the people that are suffering from issues of conservation are indigenous people. And I've noticed similarly, like I'm wearing what I'm wearing actually as a solidarity issue for the nomadic Fulani people who go. I wore something similar also yesterday from one end of the west to the east, and they travel back and forth with their cattle, and their way of life is endangered. And people come up with things like, well, homes are being built and cities are built. It's so old-fashioned. Why do they need to go with their cattle back and forth? So from my perspective, I think globally there's environmental justice has to be tied with conservation issues and environmental issues. And I also think that if the global south is not really where the abundance or excess of the destruction of the planet is happening. So we have to be also acutely aware of that, even when we're thinking about like how much dye is used and who is using it and all of that stuff. I mean, so I don't know if I answered your question actually. Okay.
Can I jump in?
Please.
There's an interesting, you're right to ask this question. Like, there's a lot that goes on in India today about, advertising this traditional block printing method, and the craft sector pays a lot of homage to the traditions of the different parts of the country, for sure. And it's not necessarily forward-looking. A lot of what they're doing is making hay from things that, from people's sentimental attachments to what went on before. The difference there, and I'm not sure, I don't know enough about the traditions of Africa or Japan, but the difference there is that in India, textiles have a political meaning, a very strong political history. And the handwork was revived by Gandhi as a way of throwing off political oppression. In fact, Gandhi's political party, the Congress Party, in the early years of Gandhi and Nehru, the price that you had to pay each meeting to be able to maintain your vote in the Congress Party was you had to bring a thread that you had spun from the time of the last meeting. You had a minimum amount that you had to present at the Congress to be able to maintain a vote. And today, the Indian flag has a spinning wheel on it. It was the form of resistance. So that idea of handwork has quite a few nuanced and not so nuanced meanings in Indian culture that I think are really fascinating. And it's this onion that, I'm so envious of you coming from this rich culture that you understand so deeply, and I'm treading on lotus leaves trying to understand this place that I'm an outsider to. And yet that's something that I started to understand early on in my time there, especially because Gandhi was from Ahmedabad. So anyway, I don't know if that's helpful.
I think for me, in terms of like ideas of conservation and retention, again, like my experience is a bit different because as somebody who's a diasporic African, as a Black American, these traditions I've been dissociated from these traditions, but I haven't been dissociated from the labor. So if I think about narratives that a lot of Black Americans have about our relationship with these items like indigo and cotton, we're taught about how our labor was exploited, but not necessarily our intelligence or our know-how or our cultural connections to them as items. So again, in terms of I don't desire to go back to the past, but to expand on what Fatimah said, you need that in order to build up on. So how do we learn about, traditional weaving and dyeing, as these were part of traditions that were very rich and very valuable, and in some ways still are rich and valuable, and that was exploited in the Americas, that it was not just, we weren't just bodies, we were also contributing our know-how, our understanding, our technology to these things. And how does that help us perceive ourselves in the context of being Americans, in the context of being and our contributions to America and to American history, but also how do we talk about that in terms of our ancestral connections to a place? So my work as an artist, again, it's reclaiming those things, but I don't think that I'm going back in time. I'm saying that, I'm paying homage to this because it's beautiful and because it's valuable, but I'm also teaching young people, it's these were things that our ancestors did. This was know-how that they had. We pay homage to them by the ritual of doing. So that's something that's very important to me, not saying that I expect everybody that I teach to go out and become weavers and dyers, but for them to have a newfound respect for it, but also understand it in the history of our development as a people. So I hope that answers your question in terms of like how I think about retention and conservation and its relevance to the past.
Could you, Stephen, just say a little bit more about the pedagogy of what happened when you took the children's faces, your students' faces, and what that pedagogical practice was?
Because I think it's important. I mean, people throw around social justice all the time, but it means nothing without empowerment. And I wanted these young boys and girls, these young men and women to feel powerful, to feel their connection to a place and to understand that these narratives have bearing on who you are. So if I think about Agasu, who was the founder of Dahomey, who was the founder of the Kingdom of Alada, Agasu is a deity in Haitian Vodun. So in Haiti, people still worship this king, this African king, as a deity. You see what I mean? Like, if I think about Sunjata, and you watch Roots, at the end of Roots, when Alex Haley goes back, and the griot says, I can trace your family back to the days of Sunjata. Kunta Kinte fought in the armies of Sunjata in the Battle of Kidina. So painting a Black American boy as Sunjata, what does that mean? You know? So for me, like, I mean, there's only so much I can do, but I think in order for us to have real social change, we have to think about the exchange of power. And what does it mean to give power and share power? So I think that, you know, by making these young people feel powerful, it's not power as in I'm putting violence on somebody else and projecting my will on somebody else. No, I have ownership of myself and my history. If you give somebody ownership of themselves and your history, you give them power. So that's what the pedagogy was for that. You know, I wanted them to feel powerful and to feel big, and for them to literally be looking down on their community, for them to be looking at their community, for them to be up in this building that's at the head of Boston Public Schools, which, you know, we'll have a conversation about that later, but for them to feel like they have a place there and they're in a high and powerful place in there. And that's my pedagogy behind that.
Thank you very much.
And I actually, thinking about your question and thinking about Ken's response there especially, I'm optimistic. I'm not feeling pessimistic, even though I'm going to think right now about Japan, where a lot of some of these patterns that have been stitched and tied for now quite a few generations, the women that are doing this are in their 70s and 80s, and there's not very many people below them that are learning this process. But on the other hand, my mentor, Hiroyuki Shindo, his son has just decided to leave Tokyo and his job in marketing, and he's moving back to Miyama and starting to work in his father's indigo studio, and he's going to continue on that generation because his father is the first generation indigo dyer. He was trained as an artist. He loved indigo. He decided he wanted to take it up. So I see also with Michelle Garcia's work, these are practitioners. It's not on a level of industry, though, but it is on a level of making people aware of where history has been with regards to textiles, with regards to our just wearing cloth, and what does that mean, and where has it come from, and I feel optimistic about people learning more and more about it, people having access to experiencing these things, to the old techniques, and trying to bring it forward. I know more people that have decided to learn how to weave, and maybe this is a generational thing because people are retiring. There's a larger population that's retiring. They want to be doing things. It could also be a level of affluence, that they have time. I don't know exactly what all the parameters are on this, but I'm encouraged by how many people are interested in these aspects of making and keeping traditions alive. Myself.
I would like to thank again Eve Zimmerman and the Newhouse Center, and did Suzanne language was she able to say, and the Paulson Ecology of Place Initiative, again, for collaborating with the Davis Museum on this event. I also want to warmly thank Lauren Coate and Arthurina Fears for their expert work putting this event together for us today. And of course, thank you again to our panelists for sharing your perspectives and expertise with us today. And I invite everyone to stay for a reception and continue exchanging about indigo and the many themes and histories that relate to it. Thank you.